Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We had stopped off on Babu Sujud Tilawah. So, Sujud Tilawah, there's certain verses in the Quran where when a person recites them, then they've got to make a sajda. And you find that a lot of the times the verses are speaking about the greatness of Allah, or they're speaking about the fact that the angels, etc., they prostrate as well as the believers. Hence, we prostrate. Or, for example, a Nabi of Allah prostrated at that in that verse it's mentioned. So you look at Surah Sad, where Allah is speaking about Dawood alayhi salam. He says, خَرَّ رَاكِعًا وَأَنَابَ. And people make sajda at that verse. So that's sujood tilawa. In the Quran, there are 14, 4, different verses where sajda is made. Sajda to tilawa is called sajda to tilawa. Everybody agrees, uh, almost everybody agrees on 14 different places. Where they differ is when it comes to the sajda in the 17th juz on the last page of Surah Al-Hajj. Allah says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu al-ka'u wasjudu wa'budu rabbakum. In the Hanafi madhab, that's not considered a sajda. Okay? And then they mention in detail where all the sajdas are. If you are hafidh, you would know them. And if you were not a hafidh, you would be looking in the Quran, so it would be marked for you. Basically, 14 sajdas. And in the Hanafi madhab, in Surah Al-Hajj, on the last page, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu rka'u, the ayah, they don't consider that to be a sajda. And there's some who consider that verse to be a sajda. However, they don't consider in Surah Sad to be a sajda, etc. In the Hanafi madhab, what's the ruling on sujood tilawa? They say it's wajib. Wajib is very close to fard, means there's a lot of emphasis put. We can say it's like compulsory almost. On who? On the person who, number one, recites that verse. So if you're reciting the verse, I'll put an R there. If you're reciting the verse, then you must make sujood tilawa. And number two, Hanafi madhab, if you are listening to the verse, okay? So if you heard the verse being recited, then you must make sujood tilawa. And they say this is regardless of whether a person intended to hear the verse or not. So let's say you go to a place where they're reciting the Quran and the sheikh starts to recite, it's in a gathering, and if he recites a verse of sajda, a person who's there in the Hanafi madhab, it's wajib for them to make that sajda. And if they had to hear it unintentionally or they didn't want to hear it, but they still heard it, they must still make a sajda. So let's say you're passing, let's say you're walking through the masjid and you hear a person reciting the verse, then you make a sajda. Okay, so they say wajib upon the one reciting as well as upon the one listening. Then they go on to a few masail. If a person's leading the salah, the imam leading the salah, and he had to recite a verse of sajda, here he makes sajda and the people with him make the sajda. How is the sajda performed? If you're in salah, let's say he finishes off reading the ayah and says Allahu Akbar, he goes into sajda straight away and says Subhana Rabbi al-A'la, same like the normal sajda. And then he stands up immediately, Allahu Akbar, and he carries on his recitation from where he left off. He doesn't have to read Surah Al-Fatiha again. So for those of you who go to Fajr in the masjid, and if your masjid on Friday is reading Surah Sajda, you'll find that after he reads the verse of Sajda, he goes down, says Allahu Akbar, then he comes back up immediately, Allahu Akbar, and he carries on, تَتَجَافَى جُنُوبُهُمْ عَنِ الْمَضَاجِعِ, the verse. Okay? So that's with the Imam. And those behind him should follow. Then there comes an instance where they mention, what if a person is behind the Imam? And as you know, a person in the Hanafi madhab who's behind the Imam, he's not supposed to be reciting any Quran. But let's say he had to recite and he had to recite a verse of sajda. Here, he doesn't make sajda. Why? Because the imam is the leader, the imam is leading the salah. So you only do what the imam does, even if that person had to read a verse of sajda. Thereafter, they go on to another mas'ala. They say, if a person had to read a verse of sajda whilst they are outside salah. So let's say, for example, right now, I'm teaching you and I read a verse of sajda. And then I go to read my salah. And in salah, I read the same verse of sajda. Bearing in mind, when I read it in this sitting, I didn't make the sajda. And then I went to perform my salah. In my salah, I read it again. Here, and I made sajda in that salah. Here, that one sajda in the salah is enough for the fact that I read it in this setting as well as in the salah. However, if I had to read it now and I made sajda, and then I had to read it in salah, and then I have to make sajda again. So notice the difference. If you did it and then you do it again, you must do it again. You did your sajda, then you read it again, you must make the sajda again. Thereafter, they mention a mas'ala which occurs. What if a person had to repeat the verse of sajda? This happens especially when you're doing hifth, or it can happen when an imam is leading the salah. He makes sajda, he gets up, he forgets which verse he is, and he goes back again. So here, let's say you recite the verse 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times, 100 times. Do you have to make 100 sajdas? They say as long as you're in the same sitting, then one sajda is enough. Let's say I'm sitting now and I want to memorize the verse of sajda, and I carry on repeating. And eventually, I finished now, I make one sajda, and it's enough. As I mentioned to you, how does a person perform the sajda? If you're in salah, Allahu Akbar, you go down, Subhan Rabbi al-A'la, thrice, you can say, and come back up, Allahu Akbar, carry on reciting. If you're not in sajda, if you're not in salah, whilst you're in a standing position, you go down and say Allahu Akbar, and you say Subhana Rabbi al-A'la 3 times, and then Allahu Akbar back to a sitting position, and it's done. You don't have to make salam. Also, when starting off the sajda, you don't have to tie your hands. It's just Allahu Akbar, down, Subhana Rabbi al-A'la, Subhana Rabbi al-A'la, Subhana Rabbi al-A'la, Allahu Akbar, and it's over. Some say you can make that sajda from a sitting position also. But they say it's better from a standing position because it shows a person's humbleness and humility. From up, they're going all the way down. That's sujood al-tilawa, a short chapter.